Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Elliot Gerson, Executive Vice President of the Aspen Institute. I'd like to welcome all of you here in the tent and also all of those who are watching what will be live streamed on YouTube and also those who will be watching it thereafter. I first want to give a special thank you to Ruth Katz and her small but terrific team. Who huddled and scrambled and merged two panels that we were going to have earlier today into this presentation that I think will be extraordinarily good. Our focus, of course, is on the public health, legal, cultural, and political earthquake in Washington this morning, the Supreme Court's decision in the Dobbs case overruling Roe versus Wade. For many of us this morning, shortly after 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. here, despite differing opinions we might have on the merits, this opinion had very deep, personal, and often profound effects on us, bringing back all kinds of thoughts and memories of whatever experiences we've had with these related issues. Before I introduce this very distinguished panel, including two, I dare say, are perhaps the only people in this tent who've actually read the opinions, and there may be more than two who have, I would like to just give two very brief notes of what I think are pertinent history. Roe, of course, was decided just short of 50 years ago. The majority opinion was written by Justice Harry Blackmun. What very few people know, and what we've talked about very rarely publicly here at the Aspen Institute, is just how close Justice Blackmun was to the Aspen Institute. Starting in 1979, he actually co-founded something called the Justice and Society Seminar. And for many years, the weeks he spent here in the summers had a profound effect on him, and some scholars think on his judicial philosophy and how it evolved over the years as well. In any event, the effect was so profound that he asked his family to distribute some of his ashes here on our campus. Indeed, here on this very meadow, and just under, I think, about 100 yards where I am standing today. So with a little help, you can look on the screen and you will see the site of a little panel, a stone and inscription, and then if you can then read the inscription and just take a second and you'll understand just how important this was to him. And just another historical note that this was so little known. I happen to be a friend of his biographer, Linda Greenhouse, who writes about the Supreme Court for the New York Times, of course. And I ran into her in Washington when the book was in galleys, and I asked him how she was going to deal with the fact that Justice Blackmun asked for his ashes to be distributed here, and also, very significantly, where else? The Mayo Clinic. And she looked at me like I was from Mars and said, "What are you talking about? He was buried at Arlington Cemetery." Well, I said, his remains are not entirely in Arlington Cemetery. So it meant a great deal to him, and I think on the anniversary of one of the most important decisions he will ever be remembered for, it's only appropriate to mention, and maybe some of you will like to go over it. Literally, it's 100 yards from here, and I can show it to any of you who wonder where it is. And just one other short personal note, because I think it's actually quite relevant to why this is such a political earthquake and where we are as a country right now. I clerked for the Supreme Court just a few years after the Roe decision. And indeed, 8 of the 9 justices were the same justices who were involved in Roe. At that time, it was not very controversial and really quite remarkable when you think about it. Justice Blackmun, of course, was a Republican appointed by a Republican president. 4 of those in the majority were Republicans, including the justice I worked for, appointed by Republican presidents. And of course, many of us forget, including in that majority opinion, was Chief Justice Warrenberger, who was by any means certainly a conservative legal scholar of his generation. So I think it's interesting to consider that a court constituted like that just 50 years ago would have its decision overruled today. And perhaps some of our panel might talk a little bit about how things have changed, obviously profoundly. With that, I'm going to introduce our really remarkable panel here today. I will do so if I can find my notes. I can. Thank you. I have them. And I'm going to do it in alphabetical order because we didn't know where they were going to be sitting. And so if they could just quickly raise their hand. Of course, Paula Johnson, president of Wellesley College and one of the nation's leading physician scientists. Katie Keith, distinguished health law professor at Georgetown, where she focuses at the intersection of health policy and litigation. Ashley Kurzinger, Director of Survey Methodology at the Kaiser Family Foundation and an expert on public attitudes toward and knowledge about abortion policy in America. Alina Solganikoff, Director of Women's Health Policy at the Kaiser Family Foundation and whose career has focused on the access to women's reproductive health care. Steve Vladeck, Professor of Federal Courts at the University of Texas Law School, expert on constitutional law, and moonlighter as CNN's Supreme Court analyst. Linda Villarosa, contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine, author of a seminal book on racism and the health of our nation, Under the Skin. And we are all incredibly fortunate to have as our moderator Elizabeth Cohen, the senior medical correspondent of CNN. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Oh. Elliot, thank you so much, and what incredible memories you have from that time and offering a perspective that I hadn't heard before. I am so proud to be and honored to be with this incredible panel on this very historic day. And thank you all for paying attention to that little notification on your app and showing up. So we're so glad to see so many people here. We're going to start first with Steve, because Steve is one of those 2 people who read the decision, and Steve is a constitutional law expert. And we want you to start at the beginning. What does this decision say, and what buckets does it leave states in at this moment?
Sure. So as I think most of you know, Mississippi in 2018, right about the time that Justice Kennedy announced his retirement from the Supreme Court, not very coincidentally, passed a new law banning just about all abortions after the 15th week of pregnancy. Initially, the litigation was structured as a way of trying to narrow Roe and Casey. Then after Justice Ginsburg died in September of 2020, Mississippi ramped up the asked the Supreme Court to overrule Roe and Casey, and that is this morning what the court did. There were a series of opinions. Justice Alito, writing for a 5-justice majority, held that there is no constitutional right to a pre-viability abortion, that there's no evidence in our historical tradition that such a right was deeply rooted, and that considerations of stare decisis, the fancy Latin term that courts generally are supposed to follow their precedents, didn't require retaining the rule of Roe and Casey. I don't imagine that many of you have read the entire opinion. I will just say, for those who did read parts or all of the draft that was leaked back in early May, one of the remarkable things about today's majority opinion is how very similar it is to that draft. Very little changed, almost nothing material, other than parts of the opinion where he's responding to the other justices. There were a couple of separate concurring opinions. Chief Justice Roberts concurred in the judgment. He would not have overruled Roe and Casey altogether. The Chief Justice would have split the difference. He would have upheld Mississippi's law while retaining the constitutional right for abortion at least up to the 15th week of pregnancy. It's part of why you might have seen different head counts as to whether it was 5-4, 6-3, or 5-3. The Chief was sort of in that, I wouldn't say middle, but at least less outside ground. There were also these interesting concurrences, I would say dueling concurrences, from Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Justice Clarence Thomas. Thomas saying, let's go, let's keep going. Let's go after contraception, same-sex marriage, et cetera. Kavanaugh saying, whoa, we're not going after any of those things. Basically a fight over the legacy, which I know we're going to talk about. And then there was, as you might imagine, a joint and fairly pointed dissent from the three liberal justices, Justices Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, with a whole bunch of pretty memorable lines. So, the bottom line is that the court has eliminated the constitutional right to an abortion. There will no longer be a federal constitutional right to an abortion. What that means, of course, is going to vary state by state. And the last thing I'll just say, Elizabeth, before shutting up, I do think it is worth stressing overnight, not even overnight, it's not yet overnight, how quickly this is producing two Americas, right? That there's going to be states in which, as of tomorrow, as of now, abortion is not available at all. There are going to be states in which abortion is still protected, at least up to viability, in some states even beyond viability. And there are going to be the states in between where maybe things will change shortly. Maybe there will be more aggressive moves to curtail abortion. And that are going to fall into that latter camp. And the divide between these two is going to be incredibly dramatic, the likes of which we don't see with constitutional rights, where access to abortion is going to be impossible in one state, widely available in the next, and so much of the fight is going to be about helping those who can't travel versus are the states themselves going to try to interfere with travel. So it's a huge decision. It is not the end of the story, right? It is in many respects the beginning of a different, much more controversial, and in some respects much more disheartening story.
So tell me if I have these three buckets right. There are states now, a relatively small number, but a significant number, where abortion is illegal at any stage of pregnancy.
As we're sitting here right now, there are already a number of states that have so-called trigger laws, and the triggers have been, for lack of a better word, triggered. I think Arkansas is one example. I think there are a handful of others where the day the court overruled Roe, the law was to go into effect. So yes, there are states. In Texas, there are no abortions available in Texas, right, as of right now. So we're already there with no abortions available in some states. There are other states that have trigger laws where the triggers will take a couple of weeks to go into effect. So
that's our second bucket.
Right.
Okay.
And then there's a third bucket of states that will still have at least some access to abortion, but where there's going to be some really nasty questions about what about folks coming from those first two bucket states into the third.
There's a third bucket, and these are the states that have actually very actively been working to protect abortion rights. Mm-hmm. So states like California, New York, Illinois, Maryland. So they're kind of, so those are the kind of, we will be too very divided, and a lot of women are going to live in states where they are not going to be able to either get abortion, or if they're going to get abortion, it's going to be very difficult for them to do it. We're even seeing states that are actually banning abortion even in cases of rape or incest. And so there's going to be quite a spectrum across the country.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Katie, you also have read the opinion. You are also a lawyer. Can you tell us, beyond what Steve said, is there sort of another layer here that you want to talk about?
There definitely is. I think, and I could even defer my remarks and do even more of a setup. I think in many ways this raises a whole host of just new questions, right? So it's sort of, in a completely non-comforting way, I'm going to raise a bunch of questions that I don't think anyone up here or anyone in this room knows the answer to about sort of the next wave of litigation that we're going to see, and questions. I think there's going to be questions within some of these states. Even if the state has an exception for protecting the life of the mother, saving the life of the mother, what does that mean? That could be litigated. You could see physicians not wanting to act because of that. There's going to be huge implications and huge questions around that. What if you don't have some of these other exceptions? There's going to be, Steve just alluded to this, but some extremely dramatic interstate questions where you're already seeing states go down this road where they're considering trying to extend their jurisdiction and their reach to women who travel across state borders, trying to reach into the other states, criminalize out-of-state behavior. There were parts of the concurrences and the dissents, and a lot of this was laid out in the dissent. I think Justice Breyer was very clear, sort of laying out what these consequences are going to be. This is not hidden. We know exactly what states are doing. They've been out there ever since this draft was leaked. And so trying to, what is going to be the future of the right to travel? And you have folks like Justice Kavanaugh in a concurrent saying, no problem, nothing to see here. This is not going to be an issue. Of course, this is fine. And that we don't know that. That's going to be fully litigated and a huge problem. Maybe Steve knows.
This is the same Justice Kavanaugh who testified at his confirmation hearing that Roe is a settled precedent.
You said it, not me. So I think, so there's questions like that. And then there's some very complicated federal state questions, right? We have huge federal, take one example is Medicaid. We have federal programs where the federal government is supposed to run family planning programs and access to healthcare and all these things. And some of these arguments were made by the Department of Justice in litigation over SB 8. That's the bounty hunter Texas abortion law. It was not successful then. I expect, and you saw some statements from the Attorney General today, that they are at least preparing, I think. They want to be aggressive. They came out strong. But they might be, coming in and saying, some of these state laws, federal law preempts. I think a big issue to watch is going to be access to medication abortion, which other folks on this panel could talk quite a bit about. More than half of women are now using that as the tool to have abortions in the privacy and safety of their own homes. It's incredibly important. It's being done through telemedicine, and some states have banned that. There was a statement from the AG today saying, we're going to assert preemption. States can't ban an FDA-approved drug since the year 2000. But all these very complicated questions, those are just some of them, and we could really get into them. I guess one thing I want to hit here, many, I think, proponents of the decision today have long argued, and you could see it throughout Justice Alito, the majority opinion, Casey, sort of the existing standard that we have has been so unworkable. Look at all the litigation it's produced. There's so many questions. States don't know what to do. This will make it so much simpler. We'll just send it back to the states. That is, I think, it was a huge premise of why they're doing, and I think that is completely wrong. I think the in-state litigation issues and questions this raises, the interstate questions it raises, and the federal state issues, and that's not even like what do companies do, and what is the private sector, and what about surveillance, and all these sort of private sector questions too. Insurers, it's a morass, I guess is what the short story is a morass, and more questions than answers.
In other words, this isn't, sometimes there are decisions that clarify and that make things sort of black and white and it's clear, and there are others that produce a certain level of chaos where lawyers get very busy. Correct. And we are talking about the latter. Am I right about that?
1,000%.
Okay.
Full employment.
Full employment.
Yeah.
We should all go to law school. Okay.
Yeah.
So Alina, we talked about those. No. Okay. We talked about those two buckets where abortion is illegal, states where abortion is illegal no matter what, as we speak, and states where that will soon be the case in the coming weeks. Where does it leave those women?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that this seems like a very seismic shift, but this has actually been happening over time. We have 9 states where there are 2 or fewer abortion clinics today, like yesterday. Mm-hmm. And so just abortion access has been constrained over the years. And so for many of those women, they have been experiencing this lack of access. This, of course, takes us to a whole new level where it is totally banned, although women in Oklahoma have been living in this situation, and many women, most pregnancies in Texas as well.
And so for those women in those states who are seeking abortions, have people already come up with mechanisms for them?
So yeah, I mean, some of the women are traveling, those who can, and I think that that's something to really consider, like those distances are far. When we look at how, these 3 groups or the 2 Americas, I mean, there are huge swaths of this country where there's not going to be abortion, mostly the South and the Midwest. In the Midwest, you'll have Illinois, you'll have Colorado, but there's very little else other than kind of in the coasts. So women are going to have to travel very long distances. There are funds that are being set up, there are abortion funds, a lot of community-based efforts to really help them pay for not only the cost of abortion, but travel, lodging. So that's going to help some, but that is actually not going to help very many. We don't actually know to say how many, but this is really going to make a huge difference to those women who live in those states. In states like California, Colorado, and New York, abortion access will continue in the way that it always has been, but there will likely be more demand on abortion providers because you're going to have women coming from other states. So we really need to think about, can the system in those in those states accommodate the influx.
Okay, thank you for that. Paula, you are the president of a women's institution, a women's college. You've been preparing for this. Can you talk about what preparations your college has done for this day?
Sure, and I think that my remarks will really reflect what we've just heard in terms of what we expected to see, and quite frankly, as Alina said, what we've been seeing happening over time. And I think history just tells us that this decision will impact access to higher education for women. And you can then say that this will impact the economic advancement and the advancement of women in so many different ways. So some of the things we've been really thinking about and working on are, I'm fortunate. We are in the state of Massachusetts where the right is pretty solid, but most of our students are not from Massachusetts. And I think that that's true for all of the colleges and universities across the country. Your situation is really dependent on where you are situated. But when you're in a state, for example, where there is access, what happens when your students are out of state? We have a large number of students from the South and from Texas. How do we work with our students and provide them with the knowledge that they need to actually access abortion when they are not on campus? A good proportion of our students do not have insurance from the college. They have insurance based on their parents. That is what the wonderful Affordable Care Act did. But you can imagine then we have then insurance from any number of states, and that's going to be a moving target. But I think we will have to work with partners to really understand what those targets are, and again, how we work with our students. And then lastly, just thinking about mifepristone, and how do we think about not only access on our own campuses, and Massachusetts is actually working on that issue in terms of improving access, but as we think about our students and when they are out of state, how do we deal with the issues we were just talking about, prescribing across state lines, and what are those options going to be? So a lot of different issues for us to think about, and that will change depending upon the state in which your school exists.
Thank you for that. Linda, you've just published a wonderful new book, The Communities That You Write About. How does this decision today impact them?
Black women and other women of color, but especially black women, will be most affected. So the abortion rate among black women is about 3 times higher than among white women because of lack of access to health care, reproductive health care especially, and contraception. Black people disproportionately live in the South. More than half of black people in America live in the South. And the South, if you take, you take an overlay of the states where abortion is most restrictive, that have the trigger laws, that's where black people live. I feel especially upset because this happened in Mississippi. Mississippi is the poorest state in the country. Mississippi is the place where there is an HIV crisis. Mississippi is a state that has a maternal mortality crisis, and maternal mortality and this abortion law are intricately connected. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die or almost die related to pregnancy and childbirth, and this law will make everything worse. Finally, I think about it because the activist Fannie Lou Hamer is from Mississippi. And what she said was, what happened to her was she had what was called a Mississippi appendectomy. So she was fertilized against her will and without consent. This is also the lack of, sorry, I said fertilized, I meant sterilized.
Some women are fertilized.
She lost her fertility.
It's been a long day.
You think? But she was sterilized against her will. This is a reproductive justice issue. My grandparents are from Mississippi. My grandmother had an illegal abortion in the 40s, and she almost died. So this is real.
She had an illegal abortion.
Illegal abortion in the 40s.
This is real.
Yeah.
So the women who you talk to in those states, as Alina mentioned, there are many states where this has been an issue even before today's decision. What have they done in order to get a safe abortion?
People are doing, I think others on the panel can talk about this, but It's frightening. It's frightening also because of the providers there are in trouble. They're being criminalized. So people have been doing a kind of DIY situation. I've talked to a lot of midwives, doulas, people trying to figure out how to get the abortions they need, and some of them just have their children. They have the kids. And if these states cared about children, it would be really much more interesting. But in many of the states where abortion is the most restrictive, that's where children are suffering the most too.
It's in many states that have not expanded Medicaid.
Right.
There are still many states that still have a limit to postpartum coverage. So after you have a Medicaid-funded birth, 60 days afterwards, you lose your coverage. The administration has been trying to offer this Medicaid extension, but there are, in many cases, fewer opportunities for coverage and for other programs to support low-income families in many of these states.
Ashley, I want to ask you a question. You work for Kaiser Family Foundation, who are surveyors and pollsters unparalleled. And when you have asked questions about this issue, knowing that this decision was, likely to come down, what kinds of responses have you gotten, and what does it mean for the upcoming midterms? Elections, not exams. Go ahead.
A lot of questions in there. So 2/3 of the public did not want to see Roe be overturned. So let's start there. So 2/3 of the public, that hasn't changed over the past decade. It's held fairly stable. That includes more than 8 in 10 Democrats, more than 6 in 10 independents, large majorities of women, and large majorities of women who are most directly impacted by this, women 18 to 49. Republicans, on the other hand, are largely supportive of the court's decision. So 6 in 10 Republicans wanted to see the court overturn Roe. At the same time, majorities of Republicans, when asked, think that abortion should largely be a personal choice rather than something regulated by law. So what happens there is that we also find that very few Republicans say that abortion should be illegal in all cases. It's about 15% of Republicans say abortion should be illegal in all cases. And larger shares, about 3 in 10 of the public overall, say abortion should be legal in all cases. But that means the vast majority of the public are somewhere in the middle, right? So they're not saying that abortion should always be legal. They're not saying that abortion should always be illegal, but there's some shades of gray there. The problem is that there's lots of misconceptions and lack of knowledge about abortion access, procedures, information in this country. You don't go around finding out the basic facts about abortion until you really need one. And so the vast majority of the public aren't aware that most abortions occur in the first 8 weeks of pregnancy. They don't know that about 1/4 of women in the US have gotten an abortion in their lifetime. And very few know about medication abortion, even though, as we stated earlier, that's how the majority of abortions occur in this country, right? So when we're asking people about what's going to happen in these states, they don't have the knowledge or information to really understand how these state policies, these state legislations are going to impact the women in this country. How it's going to impact midterms, right? So I know we're in Colorado, but I'm going to bring a little California vibe to you. So the Republicans were set up for an 100-foot wave this midterms, right? So they had an unpopular president, a midterm election with the #1 issue being the economy, most notably inflation, most notably gas prices, right? So that is setting up Republicans to take back the House, the Senate, and just win several swing states and all the stable House districts, right? What does this mean? It's not going to change that 100-foot wave into a 8-foot wave, but it may change it to 50-foot wave, 40-foot wave. We don't know, right? So the questions we've been asking about this have always been hypothetical, right? If Roe is overturned, will you be more motivated to vote? 4 in 10 voters say yes, but it hadn't been happened yet. For a large portion of this country, abortion access has always been legal. So what happens when that right is taken away? Are they going to be more motivated to vote? And a poll that we just did, right, so earlier this month, we find that the enthusiasm gap in terms of motivating voters about this after this court case. Those pro-choice voters have about a 16 percentage point gap, so they're more motivated than pro-life voters. And when we've historically thought about abortion voters as single-issue voters, it's been the other way. So will this shift some voters? Yes. Will it make some younger women or Democratic voters more motivated to turn out? Most certainly. Will it shift major elections? Unclear.
Because for the sort of people in America who sometimes vote for Democrats, sometimes for Republicans, they go back and forth, how much does abortion matter to them? And especially compared to gas prices.
Yeah, I mean, so what's the thing they're doing? They're filling up their gas tanks every week, right? And trying to pay to put food on the table, trying to pay for their household expenses. Yes, 6 in 10 independents didn't want to see Roe v. Wade overturned, but they're also struggling to afford basic living expenses. And so, it's not going to be their number one voting issue. We're not seeing any indication that inflation and gas prices are going to be trumped by abortion access.
Steve?
I think it's also worth stressing why the political calculus here is so important, right? I mean, so last year the House passed the Women's Health Protection Act, WIPA, which would have codified across the nation basically the law of Roe and Casey. It didn't get through the Senate. I think we all know why. It rhymes with filibuster. But I think, what I was looking for today, right, was, both Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema have previously said, like, health care is critically important, the court should not overrule Roe, et cetera. Were either of them going to say, maybe now it's time to blow up the filibuster? And neither did. And so even if by some miracle the 100-foot wave turns into a dud, right? I say miracle, I'm betraying my politics, I'm sorry. Right? It's certainly not going to give the Democrats 60 votes in the Senate, right? And in a universe in which the Democrats are not going to blow up the filibuster, there's nothing Congress is going to do affirmatively, I think, that's going to help sort of level out the effects of today's decision.
And just one more thing to add on, there aren't that many swing districts left in this country, right? Most House seats are very stable, and so it's not going to have huge ramifications.
Not going to have huge ramifications. All right, we will keep that in mind. Before I turn this over to questions from all of you, I have one question, and whoever feels most qualified to answer, jump in. So it's, I think, 54%-ish abortions are medication abortions, not surgical. So is this as simple as just, we'll just mail those women pills? Is it that simple to Texas or Oklahoma or Arkansas?
No.
And
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. No.
Explain why not.
Well, there's a lot of reasons why. One is that several states, 19 of them, have actually passed law. Putting aside the trigger laws, yes, let's talk about yesterday, there were 19 states that didn't allow telemedicine abortion. Either they required an in-person visit or they required a sonogram, and you can't really do those via Zoom. And so for maybe you can, but.
No, go ahead.
So in those 19 states, the vast majority, I've been looking at a lot of maps today, but there's actually, most of those states are states that are going to ban abortion. So the medication abortion is not going to be available through kind of traditional means through telemedicine for those women. I think the other thing that we have to remember is medication abortion basically is effective to 10 weeks. So it's not everybody can take medication abortion. There are pregnancies that are later that you're going to have a procedure. In addition to that, you have all of this kind of practicing across state lines and whether this is going to be banned. This is where the lawyers are going to get busy. I'm sure there are going to be test cases where you're going to have physicians practicing across state lines. It was interesting during the pandemic. We were like, oh yeah, you could do that, no problem. And then suddenly when now that the states have been lifting their pandemic emergencies, now suddenly that's going to be blocked. And so that's going to be a big issue. I think there is going to be a significant subset that are going to seek to self-manage and they're going to try to get the mifepristone, and it's usually a combination of mifepristone and misoprostol, 2 drugs, through other means outside of kind of traditional clinical care. And, you know, it's not really clear how that's going to be. I do want to say that I think the narrative is going to be different than when we think about the pre-Roe days. We are not going to have kind of these botched abortions. It's going to be very different because we have mifepristone, and that is just such a game changer in terms of abortion access. And I think that that's why abortion opponents have been so focused on trying to limit medication abortion.
Katie.
Can I just say, that's totally right. It's not going to fill a gap. I do think one of the big questions that we've seen, and you've probably seen it in the media, is what can the Biden administration do? So we sort of talked about Congress already. You know, what can the federal government do, and even what can some states do? I do think them leaning in on this medication abortion issue and trying to assert that, again, their FDA approval, FDA has approved this particular drug since the year 2000. They have very carefully regulated. It's still incredibly hard to get, and many people have argued too hard to get. And we have these restrictions. FDA just saying, we preempt is not enough. It's still going to have to be something that's litigated. We're going to need test cases. There is a lawsuit right now in Mississippi where one of the 2 manufacturers of this main drug has sued the state to say, your restrictions are preempted, and we're sort of waiting to see. I think that is, though, one of the strongest, most powerful things that the Biden administration can do. It is one of the things they came out strongly today and sort of indicated. They said they would lean in on states that fully banned the drug. Maybe they could go further than that, in my opinion, to sort of ban some of the in-person licensing requirements and other restrictions that FDA used to have on this drug that they have since pulled back. I think they could come out potentially even stronger. So it's not going to fix everything, but this is one area where I actually do think the Biden administration can lean in. Beyond that, I think their powers are limited, and maybe if that's not of interest to people, we don't have to talk about that. But the existing federal law is already quite restrictive in terms of what the federal government can do between the Hyde Amendment, between the Comstock Act, between all these existing laws on the books, Title 10. They are navigating a very narrow space, and it's why I'm sort of pumping the importance of medication abortion here.
Can I just add two other, I mean, one critical, I don't think I have to tell this audience that the FDA is, at least in theory, an independent agency, or a quasi-politically independent agency. And so we are stuck with the irony of being in an administration that actually cares about independence, when one that didn't might be more willing to put a little more pressure on. The other thing I'll just say is, it is worth putting this in context that Katie's exactly right, that I agree with Katie that the best avenue for the Biden administration, which is still not saying that much, is through the FDA and through fairly aggressive, both enforcing existing regulations and, if possible, promulgating new ones that aggressively interpret the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. You might have heard that the current Supreme Court is hostile to broad delegations of administrative authority to executive branch agencies. We might hear more about that as early as Monday in the climate change case. And so it seems like, when Katie talks about the specter of litigation, all I can say is hard to be optimistic that those kinds of delegations would clearly survive, especially in a context in which they can be challenged locally, right? Where you can handpick a judge in, I guess, somewhere in Texas, and have the litigation go through there. So, this is part of why I think it is unfortunate this is going to become such a sort of litigation story, because we're going to have a lot of sort of ping-ponging of what the law is, what the regs are, what's possible, as the courts try to sort out this mess.
All right, let's take questions from the audience. So a couple of things. One, this is a time for us to share. This has been an incredibly impactful day, but please do make sure you got a question in there somewhere. And Paulina and Maureen you can see them standing in the aisles. They're waving. And they're going to pick people, because I can't see very well. And they will get the microphone to you, so stand up just like she's doing. She's your role model. There you go. Okay.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mullins, and I'm on the board of the last abortion clinic in the state of West Virginia. And we had an emergency meeting this morning where we're essentially planning to create an underground network to get people out of the state who are seeking care. How bad of an idea is that, I guess?
Say that again.
How illegal is
How
that?
bad of an idea is
Hold on
that?
1 second. Hold on. Quiet down. Say that again. Say that again.
How bad of an idea is that?
This is like real-time legal advice is what we're doing on this panel.
So what follows is not legal advice. So I will say I don't know the specifics of the West Virginia statutory regime, and that's going to matter, right? I think there is, so Justice Kavanaugh, in his concurrence, as Katie said, went out of his way to say there's a right to travel. It's worth noting that this is the first time any Supreme Court justice has ever implied that the right to travel protects the right to travel out of state to obtain a particular medical procedure that is not constitutionally protected. So there's one citation for you, right? But I mean, I think it is revealing that he felt compelled to say that. And so it seems to me that there are avenues for those who are interested to assume that he means what he said, my snark previously notwithstanding, and that you know, as long as there is a plausible constitutional argument about the right to travel in that context, that's going to hold up. Now, there is significant litigation risk there because there are no cases on this, right? And I think it's really important for anyone who goes into this to know that, you know, the Supreme Court has not historically been especially defensive of the right to travel. And so I think it is a risk to run that kind of operation. Whether the morality of it justifies the legal risk is a decision people will have to make for themselves.
Can I just add that, and I'm not a lawyer, but I just think that the other thing that we all need to be aware of is, like, we're just getting started. And a lot of these state legislatures, they're just getting started. The National Right to Life has model legislation that actually doesn't even include an exemption for rape or incest. They are really pushing very heavy prosecution and civil. They want a combination of criminal and the civil, so SB 8
Right.
plus. So I think we're going to see a lot of legislation coming out of these states. So things are going to be moving and shaking out, I think, for the probably next year or so until we have some clarity about where we're going to land.
That's
a lot of details.
Right, that we don't know everything.
Yes.
Which is why he couldn't give you a legally binding answer to your question.
Yeah.
Well, there are other reasons why I couldn't
Oh,
give a
okay.
legally binding answer to that question.
Your insurance doesn't cover it, right? So I'm going to ask that question, I think, in a slightly different way. If I am a woman in a state that bans abortion and I travel for an abortion, could someone come after me? If I am someone who helps that woman travel from a state that bans abortion to another state, am I in trouble? Could I be in trouble?
At the moment, right, as of today, I am not aware of a state in which it would be either a civil or criminal offense to travel out of state or to facilitate the out-of-state travel to obtain an abortion in a place where it's legal. Even SB 8, the FACACTA Texas law, has been understood and has been construed by the lawyers defending it to apply to abortions performed in the state of Texas. But ask me this question again tomorrow, and the answer might be different, right? I mean, this is the key point: is that this is a moving target. And Elizabeth, you're right to frame this as if I'm a woman in that, you've got to, there are information resources out there. This is going to change day to day, week to week. And I think just sort of public education is going to be a critical part of the story.
And this isn't hypothetical. I mean, there are women today
As we
who are
speak.
trying to answer this question and get the answer to this question. So just to be
That's
clear,
why I asked it.
we're talking about laws and state regulations, but this is affecting real people
Yeah.
this very moment.
Absolutely. Katie, did you want to?
No, Steve's exactly right. This is not illegal anywhere, to my knowledge. States are looking at it. It's, to his point, Justice Kavanaugh felt strongly enough to throw it in there because I think more states are going to look. But people, women really need to know their rights right now. And if you need an abortion, you can travel to a state where it is legal to get one. I think that is where we are right now today, and it's really, really important.
And just to put a sort of a fine point on it, just because it is not illegal doesn't mean you can't be sued, right? That someone could bring a lawsuit under SB 8. And then you'd have to defend on the ground that SB 8 doesn't. You'd win your lawsuit, but guess what? SB 8 specifically bars you in that circumstance from recovering your costs and fees. So, we have to be very careful about sort of just because it's not illegal doesn't mean it carries no risk.
Right. That's an excellent point. Okay, let's see. Someone else, go ahead.
Thank you all for coming. Is there any way to legally or academically reconcile the two seemingly contradictory decisions that came from the Supreme Court this week? One, restricting states' rights to decide on gun control, and this one that we're discussing today, enabling states' rights to decide on abortion.
Are you going to use the word fakakta again?
It's a day for Yiddish. My grandmother will love that that's the line that you guys applauded. So let me take a shot at reconciling them. Let me preface by saying what follows is not necessarily the views of the speaker who is saying them. So I think the justices who were in the majority in both cases, right, would say everything rises and falls on the fact that one of the rights to them is in the Constitution and one of them is not. And that, you know, if you start from, whether we agree about the premise that X right is in the Constitution and Y right is not, we don't, right, it does seem to me logically consistent to believe that when the Constitution protects a right, it takes it away from the states. And when the Constitution does not protect a right, it leaves room for the states to innovate. You know, so that's the way I think that they would reconcile them, and I don't think that is implausible. I think what would have to be added, to be honest about this conversation, is that these same 5 justices, right, are willing to allow state interventions, right, even when the rights are protected if they don't like the rights, and are hostile to state interventions when they do like the rights. So there's inconsistency at the margins, but the theory, at least, I actually think is coherent.
I would only add that the dissent cites the Bruin decision over and over and over again, to your point, to try to say these two things don't, this is the gun, maybe we weren't clear enough about that, the gun decision yesterday. These two things don't really go together, so they tried to make that point.
And I actually thought one of the most telling exchanges in all of the opinions, Justice Kavanaugh really does play up the abortion is still going to be legal in so many states. And, you know, there's a little bit of sort of upper middle class hubris to that, right? I'm saving the Yiddish, okay? But the dissent, I think, quite rightly points out that, like, that's true only so far as there's no federal ban, right? And that you know, I mean, so I think Vice President Pence came out today in favor of a federal abortion ban, at which point, as the dissent says, it's not about travel to New York or California, it's about travel to Toronto. And so I think they are reconcilable if you buy the constitutional analysis in both cases. Of course, you know, I could, I think, spin a fairly plausible tale about how the constitutional analysis is backwards in both cases. And I think the dissents in both cases also do that.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Sue Edelstein. Here in the Valley, I've been I've lost a word. I volunteered at Planned Parenthood escorting people who were coming in for abortions. At that time, Planned Parenthood, at least locally, defined Plan B, the morning after pill, as contraception rather than abortion. Is that the generally accepted rule, and is that a straw to grasp at as far as access for some people?
Plan B, under the FDA, is defined as a contraception. Plan B cannot interrupt an established pregnancy. Ashley can talk a little bit, though, about the confusion that we found in our survey.
Yeah, and the reason why many legal scholars are looking at contraception as the next step is because a majority of the public aren't aware that Plan B cannot end a pregnancy, right? So there's a confusion that Plan B is medication abortion. They don't understand the differences. And so there is a huge swath of the population that has no understanding of what emergency contraception is and how that differs from medication abortion.
I think that's true. That's true as well as we think about Plan B. It's also true for IUDs in terms of the current movement to consider both of those abortifacients.
Yeah.
And you know, Alina and I were both on the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, on the panel that really provided the evidence that the full range of contraceptive services were preventative medicine, and that is how it got into the Affordable Care Act. And we're seeing that really as This is the next frontier, beginning, I think, with these two, with Plan B and IUDs.
Talk a little bit about IUDs. There was a movement to consider them?
Well, I think, again, there's a lack of knowledge, and there is talk about both of those ending early pregnancies, and that is incorrect. They are contraceptives. But I think, again, the misperception of what those two contraceptives do is pretty significant. And there is a movement afoot to address those two forms of
I
contraception.
mean, if you look at the Texas Medicaid waiver, the two things that they banned, they asked the federal government for a waiver, special permission to waive Medicaid rules. One was banning Planned Parenthood, and the other was banning emergency contraception from their Medicaid program. So, you know, you've already seen the germs of that. The Hobby Lobby case, their objection was to, it wasn't all contraception, was Plan B, emergency contraception, and the pills, and IUDs.
That's a lot.
So,
Now, we should say, there are no states today, right, that ban categorically Plan B or IUDs,
no.
right? But there have been noises made by, I believe, legislators in Mississippi, and Missouri, and Idaho, and I think one of the things to watch is even on the contraception side of the line, are we going to see those efforts ramp up in the coming days and weeks, armed with this new decision and with the analysis and the majority opinion?
and sorry, just, that goes back to the need for information and education, accurate information, because that's just going to make such a critical difference.
Can I add too? I think in this universe, right, we would really ramp up contraceptives in all these ways, not even just but the full range. What I do not want to say to you, but that I feel like this room needs to know, there's already litigation trying to dismantle the current programs and access to contraceptives that we have. So the preventive services mandate under the Affordable Care Act that Paula is mentioning that is so critical is probably going to be declared unconstitutional any day now by Judge Reed O'Connor, who's this Texas judge who who might sound familiar because he's the judge who wanted to hold the entire Affordable Care Act unconstitutional. Steve and I spend a lot of time talking and writing about Judge Reed O'Connor. If that happens, you're sort of dismantling access to free contraceptives for women with private health insurance. We've also seen attacks for women who need access to the Title X family planning program. There's these assaults on Medicaid, and a lot of it is actually already in the courts, bubbling up. It has not yet reached the Supreme Court, but it's coming. And so you're going to start no one should be surprised if you see a headline in a few weeks that is like, the preventive services mandate is gone, access to contraceptives for women, for the 155 million people with private health insurance is now going away too.
And I want to ask you a question sort of off of what Katie just said. In the communities that you've written about, talk about, since access to contraception is going to get more important than ever, talk about that access or lack thereof.
I actually want to say something slightly different.
Sure.
Social justice and social change often happens from the ground up. And so what we haven't talked about here is anger and activism. This is not about abortion only. This is about body autonomy. This affects younger people who are pissed off and who don't. This is a bad look. This is terrible. There is a lot of anger swelling up. And I think we have to pay attention to the anger and the activism and figure out how to galvanize it. But we also can't make the mistake of having abortion be a single issue. It's not about only that. It's about the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to raise children in a healthy, safe environment. And that is just reproductive justice.
Given the enormity of what happened today, in what way can you see that groundswell of anger, which, as you said, is so important, and activism, in what way, if you try to look into the future, in what way could that make a difference, given what happened today?
I've done a lot of reporting around the Black-led reproductive justice movement. So, when when the first decision was leaked, and even today, there was on my social media feed, it was like, oh my God, it's a Handmaid's Tale over again. This surprised exactly 0 Black women who have been in this. This is not we've been dealing with a handmaid's tale, living in these poor states, having reproductive injustice for centuries, over and over again. So it's time to, the motto is listen to Black women. We know how to do this thing. It's only 3 things: the right to have a baby, the right not to have a baby, and the right to raise children in safe, healthy environments. It has to be intersectional. This is not only about abortion. That's what I got.
Can I just add one thing? So we are all paying very close attention to all of this that's happening. I'm sure everyone's social media feeds were all about this today. Everyone in this room has been paying close attention. And we were paying close attention when the leaked decision came out, right? That is not the majority of the public, right? We know women that are living in these states where there were trigger laws or pre-Roe bans aren't aware that abortion will no longer be accessible to them in their states, right? So these women are, living their lives and, taking care of families and going to work. And so what happens when all of a sudden abortion is no longer available to them? They haven't been following it, but now it's real, right? It's no longer hypothetical. It's actually a reality in those states. And so that's something we're going to be watching too, see if it does motivate voters in a way that, we could only measure in polling in a hypothetical way previously.
Let's see, a question from either side. Oh, go right here. Okay.
Hi, I'm curious if you anticipate there might become a black market for this oral and the implications of that, like what are the risks of it, and if a woman in a state where it was illegal did attempt on their own and had complications and had to go to a hospital.
I mean, I think that there's already efforts to try to educate women. I think whenever you have something that's banned, there's going to be a black market. I just think that's happening. I think that there are, self-managed abortions and self-managed abortions. And so I think we're going to have, there are organizations like Aid Access that have been providing, it's not necessarily a black market, but it's not considered, the FDA does not consider that the appropriate way to go in the United States, let's say. And so I think we are going to see that without a doubt. So I think there are a lot of efforts in the kind of reproductive rights and reproductive justice community to provide information and education to women who are seeking abortion. There's websites. Plan C is a website that has a lot of really good information for individuals to kind of try to make some decisions. But I think you're absolutely right that we're going to have to really be vigilant to make sure that, that people get good information and safe information.
Yeah. Paula.
I just want to get back for a moment to what Linda said, because I think the intersectional issues are really critical to address. It's not too long ago, and we still are living through a pandemic in which a very large percentage of women left the workforce, were forced to leave the workforce. We still have not addressed issues of childcare, and now we have this and the threat of loss of ability to potentially access contraception, and you add this with abortion. This is a major set of issues in terms of the advancement of women, and I do think if we begin to speak about these issues, yes, with this specific one, but this is a series of very problematic areas that have really set women back as a group, with women who are low income, black and brown, being set back even further. So this is a very, very difficult time in the United States, and again, addressing the full range of these issues is going to be essential.
My name is Bob Ratner. My understanding is that one of the underlying premises of Roe v. Wade was the identification of a right to privacy. To what extent does this ruling override any right to privacy, and then what are the implications of that?
That's you.
I really should have sat at the end. on its face, the ruling does not override the right to privacy in the abstract or Griswold versus Connecticut, the 1965 decision that articulates that right most expressly. One of the biggest, I think, once we go past, which is, I feel weird saying, but once we go past the specific question of reproductive rights, I think the biggest question today's decision raises is what it means for the right to privacy, and the justices are all over the place on this. So Justice Thomas goes out of his way in his concurring opinion to say, I think we should revisit all of our substantive due process cases, the doctrinal term for the construct that the right to privacy was recognized under. And he specifically cited Griswold, Lawrence versus Texas, which recognized the right of same-sex couples to engage in intimacy, Obergefell, same-sex marriage. And you know, the Kavanaugh concurrence, the majority opinion say, no, 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 this is abortion specific, trust us. And you know, what is, leaving aside the trust question, as the law professor in me looks at the analysis in the majority opinion, which is all about how we recognize rights that are not expressly mentioned in the Constitution, and insists that those rights have to be deeply rooted in our historical traditions, and sees alarm bells. Right? You know, I think it's possible the court is not going to overrule the right to privacy, is what Kavanaugh says, but as the dissenters say, if that's true, then the majority is incredibly hypocritical, because why is the right to privacy okay, but not the right to a pre-viability abortion on that logic? So, you know, I think the dissent has this, in my view, right. Either the right to privacy is now very vulnerable, or it isn't, and the majority opinion is incredibly hypocritical. It is one or the other. And which one, I think, remains to be seen.
Hi there. My name is Fisher Cherry. I have a two-part question. Is it possible to sue or organize a class action lawsuit against Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett as individual citizens, given they lied during their confirmation hearings? And if it is possible, what's like the perfect scenario that we should look for?
Nope, I'm not touching that one. Go ahead.
There are 7 of us. Okay. No. Let me sort of say a couple different things. One, no, you can't sue judges. They have something called judicial immunity. And so even if you could certify a nationwide class action, parentheses, the Supreme Court has made that a lot harder in the last few years, close parentheses, you couldn't sue them. To the lying question, I think 2 things are true. I think, one, multiple successive Supreme Court nominees walked a very fine line to say what they needed to say to get Susan Collins' vote. And 2, I think those answers were wordsmithed so precisely that you would actually have a hard time in a court of law showing that they were perjury. We all know they were, we know, but perjury is not the same thing as we know.
Okay, well, so much for that lawsuit. Okay,
Yeah.
so I think on this side now.
Yep, my name is Ryan Cotton. My question is from a healthcare practitioner standpoint. Starting today, tomorrow, next week, an individual, a healthcare provider that is in a state that is now illegal to provide abortions, what happens when it comes to consulting, giving advice, documenting in the medical records what their suggestions are? Are they liable of being criminalized just for making a recommendation? Where's the line in the sand as to what physicians can do?
Not the legal, but the state law. I mean, the state laws mostly criminalize providers. It was one thing I was thinking we hadn't actually talked about yet is there's a huge, I think the point of these laws, even going back to SB 8 in Texas, is the chilling effect on having these services made available. And so, it will depend, sort of same as West Virginia, right? It will depend very specifically on what the state law says and what someone's risk tolerance is. But in Texas, it was quite effective at saying these lawsuits are going to shut down this whole program. You're not going to have providers willing to do it. It's why we're talking about sort of across state lines licensing and consulting and all of that. I think there's, and one thing maybe we haven't said is like the implications for miscarriage management, like a whole host of, from that perspective as a provider, being able to give the best care to your patient and feeling like your hands are tied, I can't even imagine being in that situation as a physician, as a provider, or as a patient. And it's just gonna be incredibly complicated. I think there's gonna be coding issues. As someone who does a lot of insurance work, are there different ways to code that? I think, like, are we gonna see a lot of different changes that way? Are people gonna find workarounds? Again, more questions than answers from my perspective, but most of these laws are focused on the providers.
I think it goes two ways. I think also the willingness of patients to have a relationship and to speak with a clinician honestly, candidly about their situation. You know, I think we got a bit of a glimpse of that with the Title X changes with the Trump administration, where they basically banned providers, clinicians from counseling women and making referrals for abortion services, you know, and they said if you did that, you couldn't get federal funds. So, you know, we've already kind of seen a window to that, and, you know, some of the providers said, hey, we don't want to play in this program, we don't want, they walked away, Planned Parenthood walked away, but others, and especially in many communities where there weren't other options for low-income women, and so, you know, that does impact care. So I think that's a really, you know, valid question, but I think we don't have the exact answer.
Well, and I think the insurers are also going to be an important part of the story, right? Because, you know, insofar as the insurers are in dialogue with the providers about what there will be coverage for, what there will not be coverage for, I think that's going to inform certainly some of the analysis and some of the decisions.
A lot of states already ban private insurance, like state-regulated plans, from covering abortion. A lot of the trigger states already say, like, I think there are, you know, over 10 states that basically say you can't buy a plan that has insurance coverage in the state market. Half of the healthcare marketplaces, the ACA marketplaces, also don't include abortion coverage in their plans. So we've already been seeing that, not to mention Medicaid and the Hyde Amendment, which, you know, you have, I think 16 states use their own dollars to pay for abortions for low-income women, but the vast majority of states say, we're not, you know, you're on your own because the federal government says you can't pay for abortion in cases of, unless it's a pregnancy resulting from rape, incest, or a life threat. And that was yesterday.
I think another issue is it will discourage healthcare providers from going to these, you know, wanting to practice in these states that are already disadvantaged and have a lack of healthcare providers and access to healthcare, especially, you know, we're talking about the South.
So I think a question from that side.
Hi, all. Thank you so much for this discussion. My name is Shada Brown, and Linda, especially to you, thank you for talking about the anger and the activism and the organizing. That is definitely the spirit I'm coming to this mic with today. A few of us, we're Healthy Communities Fellows in a fellowship here, and a few other attendees spent our lunch hour actually like talking about what action steps could be taken, not just individually, but in light of the power we're all sharing in this room today. So we actually put together a few recommendations we wanted to put out there to this group, but I would love to share those and then hear from you all about what recommendations, especially for this audience, corporations, organizations, you know, philanthropists, the people who you know are in attendance, what can their corporations do? We've seen Patagonia and Dick's Sporting Goods already come out with statements and commitments. So here are some ideas we came up with. You know, we recommended that corporations contact insurance brokers to understand how healthcare coverage of abortion is affected by state-by-state restrictions, or maybe employees do that to make sure what their companies are doing. Add travel benefits to your offer for employees seeking out-of-state abortion care, and or ensure your employer plan covers travel for out-of-state healthcare procedures, including abortion, and immediately, not through reimbursement if possible. Redirect 1% of your organizational budget to a local abortion funds, provider, and or advocacy organization. We have a list of those if you're interested. And give employees time off to attend protests, voter registration drives, and participate in upcoming elections. So yeah, that's all, and then we would love to hear for individuals.
There is some work being done right now to actually work with employers around this. Rhea Ventures has done a lot of work trying to get that, to stand up to really educate and inform employers about the importance of abortion coverage as well as travel, and particularly that issue where you reimburse, and particularly if you have a low-wage worker, you have to come up with the money and then get paid back. A lot of people, I think it's like 1/3 of Americans can't come up with $400 in case of an emergency. So, I mean, this is, and we're talking about real money for individuals, so I think that's an excellent start.
Anybody else want to?
I think I want to just add, we do not have pro-woman, pro-family policies, period. We have not been able to get childcare. And I think, we have got to think about this seriously, holistically, because if we can't even get policies that so-called support families, which I think everyone would agree with, then I think the chances of moving very specifically here are low. And we have got to re-examine how we consider, promote, create advancement for women in general. And this is part of it, but we have not, even after a pandemic when so many women were suffering, families were suffering, we still cannot get a policy through on support for childcare nationally or paid family leave. There are states that do this, but it really is going to require a larger agenda.
Both of which are very popular.
I always make you ask that.
Thanks. Sibel Bjorklund, and thanks again to everybody up there. And Ashley, love your quips there. It's helpful to know what's popular, although popular doesn't always win, as we know. One question I had was on the insurance coverage at the state level, and thank you for those depressing answers, Katie, Steve, and Alina, that it's already prohibited in many of the states from the package.
We're having trouble
The
hearing
insurance
you,
coverage. You preemptively answered that. The second one is about, and this is especially around motivating additional groups of people. I have my head all turned around and wonder if one of you can comment on the implications for fertility, right? Fertility treatments.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other part of this, correct?
Yes, I mean, there have been discussions about whether states might also try to restrict access to IVF, to other forms of fertility care, et cetera. I don't think those have gotten very far. I don't think there's been that much noise at the state legislative level.
I haven't been hearing.
I will just say, I mean, guys, it's we're less than 12 hours from the decision, right? I mean, I think this is an earthquake in both directions. And so I think it's going to be interesting to watch in the coming days and weeks whether that is also something we hear more of. I will say this goes back, I think, to the privacy question, because it seems like one of the pillars of the constitutional right to privacy that we don't talk about that often is medical autonomy outside the context of reproductive rights, end-of-life medical decisions, right? Things of that ilk that we now, I think, largely take for granted that are actually resting on much the same constitutional foundation. And so, I don't think this is going to be something that changes overnight, but I don't think it's also off the table in a way that it's not, that we shouldn't also be paying attention to it.
Yeah, I would only add, I think it maybe goes back to what Ashley was saying, of people don't understand this. So I have no doubt states are going to move forward with things that probably will, whether they intentionally did it or not, have implications for IVF and fertility and all these other things because they don't actually understand basic physiology or how things work. But I do think that we're not there yet. I think that's something to wait and watch for probably early next year.
Ruth Katz, I have a question for you. We are creeping up on 6:30. Do you want us to end, or we are all happy to go all night? So you just, I'm going to speak for them, sorry. Four questions, okay? I'm getting the last one, so I'm going to take 3. Does that sound good? Okay. All right, which I think we're over here.
Hi, thanks so much for taking these questions. Jessica Glenza with the Guardian Senior Health Reporter. I have, I guess, one thing to raise to Linda Villarosa's point that I think is an interesting and positive development, which is there is a ballot initiative in Michigan that is a constitutional amendment to establish in law many of the reproductive justice tenets that you described. In other words, the right to decide when to bear children and to do so in a healthy environment. So that is one interesting thing that's happening at the state level in a state that could otherwise be banning abortion. So perhaps just a little bit of hope before I ask you this extraordinarily depressing question. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the potential for the establishment of fetal personhood in the courts or in state legislatures. It's my understanding that courts in South Carolina have already done some work to establish fetal personhood, and if you could also comment on their implications for IUDs and IVF. Thank you.
Oh, that's a really
Sat in the
So,
middle. You sat right in
I
the middle.
did. Short version. I don't see anything. I don't think it's likely that there are 5 votes on the U.S. Supreme Court for a federal constitutional right to fetal personhood. 2, 3, maybe 5, no. The problem is that once Roe and Casey are gone, as they are, if states choose to create state constitutional rights to fetal personhood, the only way to displace that is through federal law with which that's inconsistent. And so that's where we come back to the FDA part of this story, which is, are there going to be federal laws surrounding fertility treatments, federal laws surrounding contraception, federal laws surrounding all of those things with which fetal personhood would be inconsistent? I think the answer is yes, but it's going to have to be litigated. And I think this goes back in many ways to where we started, which is there is now a minefield of litigation of questions that for 50 years had been settled.
All right, I think a question from that side.
Yeah, hi, I'm Erin Williams. I'm a lawyer and ethicist, and I want to ask an optimistic question because I'm really bummed out generally. But as I'm hearing about all the things, the great list of things that we might run at, I'm wondering, why don't we go big? What about a U.S. constitutional amendment? Can we learn from civil rights? Can we learn from other things? What would be involved in working, tactically to try to push for a constitutional right to an abortion?
Well, once we get the Equal Rights Amendment passed.
Right.
So I would say, just a reminder, constitutional amendments, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states. I'm not good at math, but that's a lot.
I am good at math, and that is a lot. I could stop there, but I mean, so realistically, right? So that is perhaps not where people that are looking to ensure abortion access, where energies would be spent, right? It's really going to be in the state actions, ensuring travel, ensuring medication abortion. That seems to be where the action is now. It really is seemingly impossible for that to be the case. Yeah.
All right, so the last question from the audience, so now we're on this side. Is there a question over there?
No.
No? Okay, is there a question over here? Oh, wait a minute, go ahead, I see somebody's hand.
Hi, Karen Landman. I'm a senior health reporter with Vox.com. Thanks for taking the last question. I've heard the idea floated that there may be legal grounds for pursuing a lawsuit on the basis of infringement of religious rights by a Jewish party. Can somebody please comment on whether that is a feasible strategy going forward? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Florida?
Just scooch.
It's Florida. It's Florida. There's a synagogue in Florida it's suing Governor DeSantis and challenging Florida's abortion restrictions on the ground that under their particular construction of halakha of Jewish religious law, they're not compelled to obtain an abortion, but the right to obtain an abortion is protected, is recognized, et cetera. Okay. Under a straightforward reading of the Supreme Court's Free Exercise Clause jurisprudence, before today, that was a very good argument, if you assume that the Supreme Court is going to neutrally and faithfully apply its Free Exercise Clause jurisprudence neutrally and faithfully. Here's the complication. Even under the court's existing Free Exercise Clause jurisprudence, the state can still win if it survives strict scrutiny. That is to say, if it shows that the restriction is narrowly tailored to vindicate a compelling government interest. Before today, it would have been hard for Florida to defend an abortion ban as vindicating a compelling state interest in the face of a federal constitutional right to a pre-viability abortion. It is now a lot easier for Florida to defend that. So I think it's worth pursuing. It is worth making the argument. I think the tricky part is going to be that it might actually be a infringement of religious exercise that is nevertheless justified under the way the Supreme Court applies its free exercise cases.
So I get the last question, and it is to Linda. Linda, you gave some excellent advice during this talk, which was to listen to black women. I know that you don't speak for all black women, and black women don't speak as a block or think as a block. But given all the work that you've done speaking with black women, given what happened today, what advice would they give for steps forward?
I would say don't get depressed, okay? There's no room for that. There's no time for that. There's no space. We just heard two things in this room. We heard the young folks getting together and coming up with a list of suggestions over lunch. We heard West Virginia is a very poor state. Create an underground railroad type thing to get women. But we have to not get depressed, not get stalled. My favorite reproductive justice organization, Black-run, Black-led, Black-run, Black-created, is Sister Song. So many of you know Sister Song, an excellent organization that's been doing this work for years. Go on their website. I read their manifesto that they put out, a few hours ago, years ago, and then a new one a few hours ago. Yeah. Learn what this is. And this isn't about abortion. It has to be intersectional. Listen to what Paula's saying. We have to support parents. If you're going to force women to bring children into the world, families, then you have to do something about working parents especially. So this is not a single topic. I know this is scary because it's the day that this happened with abortion, but it is intersectional. It's got to be about the bigger issue. And this is our opportunity to do it right this time. And I was thinking about what you were saying, Ashley. It's like, oh, this many people, take this many and that many. It's like, well, how did the NRA, who is a tiny little sliver of people, hijack gun rights? We need to have that same kind of, not that, but something similar, where we are saying, we're mad, you cannot take our body autonomy away, and push back.
Many thanks to all of you. You were just amazing and really helped put today's news into perspective and talked about paths forward. Ruth, thank you and your team for putting this together so quickly. Thank you.